All right, the Subjective Professor Podcast, episode 14. We're going to talk about a ginormous topic, institutional racism. What is it and what to do about it? My wife has made a note that the episodes are getting longer, and I pushed back and said, well, these topics are huge. This one will probably hit around 20 minutes, but I'm going to talk kind of quickly and move along quickly as well. All right, so institutional racism, when most people talk about it, it has three characteristics. Number one, it is systemic. Number two, it shapes everyday social relations. And number three, the definition of race that we're talking about is going to change over time. So in other words, institutional racism is not racism from an individual, a single person or two people, but rather the racism is it exists and is inherent in the very system in which we're living, right? So although a corporation can be institutionally racist because it's an institution and it's discriminatory, but a society can be, a community can be, a nation can be, all right? And so when we get to the level of country, the country is institutionally racist, then what we're saying is that the racism is system-wide. There is nowhere you can go where you will be able to escape the racism that exists in that society. And because of it, it shows up in all of our relationships. Every time we talk to someone else, you'll be able to see signs and evidence of this institutional racist system. And it's so hard to pin down, people will say, because definition, what race is, how it's being expressed, is going to be changing over time. Now, when we talk about institutional racism, it's in favor of whites, okay? So institutional racism, if you ever read any of the writings on it, they will all generally talk about white supremacy or white privilege or something white, right? So the system favors whites, which is why white people generally are more successful, have higher positions, more powerful occupations than colored people. All right. So whites are more successful than blacks in society because of institutional racism. And also, I just want to note if institutional racism, oh, excuse me, my mistake. Coming back to this, attempts can be made to overcome institutional racism, but although we can see the effects of institutional racism, it's hard to pinpoint and overcome the root issues. And I'm all about root issues, and so this is could be potentially a really, really difficult nut to crack. Okay. Also, what makes things worse is that any attempt, and this is all within the discourse of institutional racism, any attempt to unwind institutional racism or try to compensate or try to mitigate, reduce the effects of institutional racism, it's problematic because all of those attempts will come from whiteness, right? So since the system itself is already centered and focused on white supremacy, any attempt to try to reduce the effect of white supremacy will be from white supremacy. And so everything is tainted, and so you're never really ever going to escape it. You just got to learn how to live in it, right? And so this is why so many people are focusing on what white people can do to sort of offset all of their discrimination in their lives. I think might be a reason. It just occurred to me that this is why so many people are pushing reparations now, because you can't undo the system. The system is hopelessly corrupted with white supremacy. And so therefore, the only thing we can do is reparations, give money to people who are victims of this institutional racism. Okay, so that in a nutshell, 4.5 minutes, is institutional racism. And, not to belittle it, because I do want to critique it, spend more time critiquing it, and then try to propose a solution, right? Unlike a lot of the writers who are in the discourse itself, who basically state that there are no solutions. Okay, so here's the critique. To see institutional racism and write about it in the way that all these scholars are doing, subjectively valid. I mean, from their perspective, what they're seeing it's true. And, okay, I can go along with that. From their subjectivity, what they see is true. Their truth is legitimate from that perspective. But of course, most of the writings that I've read, if not all of them, about institutional racism, they have a hard time defining what white is. I talked about this in the previous episode, but what is whiteness? Please define that for me. And generally, people will just sort of laugh it off and say, "Oh, you know what I mean." But it might be difficult. Okay, fine. But then it also becomes convenient not to be able to pinpoint it, because now you can be vague and pretty much anything can be, blamed on institutional racism. So without a clear definition, it's hard to move forward, right? So in the absence of definitions, most writers will talk about examples. They'll point to certain situations and they'll say, "See, institutional racism." Okay. But see, now we're back to that Socratic problem, the problem that Socrates always had when he would have a dialogue with someone. They would give him examples, and he's like, "No, no, no, you're giving me example. I want a definition." Because having a good definition, then we can identify all of the instances where, in this case, for example, we see institutional racism. And then we can also see what is not, right? And that's what's so important about a good definition. So when people normally talk about institutional racism, there is no solution. And the problem is that even when you try, when you're like, "I believe what you're saying, let's do something about it," it's all whiteness again, right? So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And so what do you do in a situation like that? Okay. And even this critique that I'm recording right now, of course, is white. Even if I'm not white, right? And I'm not, right? But even if I'm not white, this critique becomes white, right? Because it's pushing back against institutional racism as such. Another problem is that people assign color to certain behaviors, right? Or ownership of certain kinds of behavior uh, to certain colors or demographic groups, right? It's as if there is exclusivity, right? It's exclusive. Only certain people are allowed to do it because it belongs to them, right? And I think this is an easy argument to make in the United States because of the whole intellectual property phenomena, right? So people more or less are taught about copyright laws and spying, corporate espionage, and so therefore this whole idea that certain behaviors or certain cultural practices belong, they're the property of certain behavior. I think that becomes an easy sell. And of course, from this, you can see this a variation, cultural appropriation, right? This becomes kind of a interesting spin-off. But then if you were to consistently apply that way of understanding things, then who gets the wheel, right? Who came up with the wheel first, right? Because someone had to have come up with it first, or multiple people came up with it first. And so it belongs to them, right? I mean, if we're going to go that far. And so then people might say, "Oh, no, we're not talking about that. We're only talking about these things," right? Oh, okay, fine. So then we're going to basically slip into hypocrisy, right? So only certain things we're going to make a big deal of about, and oh, surprise, surprise, conveniently, it happens to be the things that you care about, but everything else is a non-issue, right? And that's hypocrisy. The reality is that ideas are shared, right? We travel the world, we encounter new people, and we see what they're doing and how they're doing it, and we're like, "Wow, that is so much better than what we're doing. I like that more than what we have. So let's try to imitate it." Is that a bad thing? Is that espionage? Is that spying? Or is it just sharing ideas? So not all ideas are going to be spread, only ideas that have some sort of traction, that gives some sort of benefit to the people who are going to adopt and believe and sort of operate with those ideas. And a lot of ideas will be rejected by the same group of people. So it's basically the people who will benefit from those from the encounter with different ideas. It's those people who will lose power and privilege and status if too many people, or if even some people, start doing things differently, right? So the people who enjoy all of the status and the power and authority that is given to them, if things do not change, well, then they get really upset when people start making different choices, right? And building on that, within the discourse of institutional racism, you will hear Black scholars saying that certain choices are off limits for Blacks, right? They should not do it because by doing it, they're expressing self-hate, right? They're internalizing whiteness, a form of self-hate, and then they try to imitate white people, right? Like dyeing their hair blonde or straightening their hair, having extensions, try to have that flowing hair that white people have. And once you state that, once you say that out loud, then you realize, and you recall one of our earlier episodes where I talk about when we deconstruct religion, well, it smacks of religion, right? So you have your leaders within the discourse of institutional racism where they declare what is orthodox and what is heretical, right? What is acceptable, what is truly Black behavior, and what is white, right? So you have this dynamic going on where once you realize that the scholars are the priests and they are now producing information, telling everyone the right way to live, well, now it becomes obvious what's really going on. They're protecting an orthodoxy. They're protecting what they believe is the right way to live. And also because now we see it as a religious exercise, um, a lot of what they're discussing is indicative of a lack of tolerance of the preferences and choices of others, right? Oh, how could you possibly do that? When clearly our kind of people don't do that, right? And so it's a lack of tolerance, right? So under the cover of trying to teach people the right way to do things to overcome this horrible example of racism, that's institutional racism, they're actually teaching intolerance to people. It's kind of interesting when you look at it that way. Obviously, half of you, whoever's listening to this, if you're able to still listen to this, then more power to you. I'm happy you are. Some people will talk about how the language of the society itself is discriminatory, right? So English has so much racism built into the grammar or the terminology, and so we have to ban a lot of the language. What when someone makes that kind of argument, it tells me that that person can only speak one language, right? Because if you speak multiple languages, you realize that every language has baggage, right? But most languages do not have the same baggage as other languages, right? And so if things become problematic in one language, just switch your language, right? I do that all of the time. It's very flexible. There's no awkwardness, and so we don't ever have to talk about institutional racism. So to be fixated on the language and start banning and censoring words, even though we have freedom of speech here in this country, yeah, it's probably because you only know one language, and so your subjectivity is further hampered and restricted and confined because of that. Now, I know there's a lot of negativity, and so I'm not saying do nothing, right? Because doing nothing is as bad as being a racist, right? Because we got to do something. Something must be done. Well, why don't we, and we're about to hit the 15-minute mark, so ask for 5 more minutes, okay? So the easiest way to understand institutional racism is imagine a basketball game, right? So a basketball game, it has very clear rules, and as a result of the rules, certain people have an advantage over other people. Because of the rules of basketball, the size of the court, the location of the basket, of the hoop, tall people, fast people, people who have a very high level of coordination, people who can jump, who can think on their feet, who have great field vision, or excuse me, court vision, right? These people have an advantage over other people who've never played basketball. Okay. And so it's the rules themselves which dictate who will succeed and who will fail, who will have an advantage and who will have a disadvantage. And so now the way out, the way to resolve institutional racism should become clear to us now. If the rules are the source of the institutional discrimination that we see in society all around us, well, the solution is to roll back all those rules. A lot of the hypocritical rules, and I said this way back in the first episode, is that the injustice in society comes from hypocritical laws. And so just roll them all back, get rid of them, repeal them, tear them up. And what are you left with? You are left with voluntary association. Voluntary association and voluntary choices that we are now free to make, that we couldn't make before because of all the rules and laws and restrictions and penalties and punishments imposed on us by the rules of government. And so if we get government out of the way, we let people do what they want, they will seek out the choices that work out best for them. Remember, keep in mind what I said, bad choices are really, really expensive. And so people will stay away from those bad choices. And so with voluntary association, voluntary choices, if people see a choice that they believe will improve their situation, let them do it, right? You may not see the advantage. You may only see heresy, but that's because it's not your subjectivity. Allow people to make the choices that they want. And over time, people will figure out, right? Either by, listening to people with more life experience, what are bad choices, probably what are potentially bad, or maybe to consider, how do I make a bad choice a good choice? You can have all of this creativity there if we had freedom to be able to do so. Having voluntary association choice in this way allows us then to exercise whatever supremacy that we may have. Remember, white supremacy is only one form of supremacy. Every racialization has its advantaged and privileged group and disadvantaged one, right? So everyone has something that they are superior to other people, or at least competitive with other people. And so, right, so the basketball example, for example, when I was younger, I saw basketball, I tried basketball, and then realized, yeah, I'm not interested in this. And so I found another sport, right? A much better sport, right? So that's what we need. We need the freedom to be able to make an alternative choice, especially when we realize the choice that we're forced to make will only result in our disadvantage. So legislation of morality creates the systems of advantage and privilege for many racializations that often go unnoticed. We don't notice that they're there benefiting from the legislation that was just passed. I gave you numerous examples already: city sugar taxes, even the national sugar tax, legislation designed to help people results in inflation, which actually punishes those people, at the same time rewards another group of people behind the curtain, etc. This is happening all over the place. And we can get into specifics sometime in the future. So laws produce the institutional racism that people are so upset about. And then, to add insult to injury, people engage in even more political activity, political activism, to create even more unjust laws, thereby making institutional racism worse. So voluntary association does not ignore the individual, right? And the individual probably would be able to gain much, much more without all of these restrictions. At the same time, they may also lose. But once we start focusing on the individual, then another aspect of the problem of the institutional racism discussion as such, as it is discussed, becomes really obvious. Most people only talk about whites and blacks, white-black dynamic, a binary. Well, what about everybody else? What about the yellows, the browns, and reds, whatever color you want to put in there. What about them? Where do we fit in that situation, in that dynamic, or we just sort of observe? I'll close with a simple example of adaptation and flexibility that I believe would happen much, much more frequently if the government just simply got out of the way. So when Asians first came to the United States, they were brought as laborers. They weren't allowed citizenship, and so they had no protections with about property, even self-defense. They didn't have any of these rights because they didn't have citizenship either. So they couldn't own property. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, they were all laid off. So they all went back to California, but because of the political unrest in Asia, they couldn't go back. So what are you going to do? You're stuck in California. You're not allowed to own land, right? You can't farm. You're not allowed to fish. When the gold rush happened, you weren't allowed to pan for gold either, right? So what are you going to do? Well, you notice that everyone's dirty, filthy, their clothes are filthy, and no one knows how to cook. So you start restaurants, you start laundry businesses, and you make a living that way. Laborers then can work for other people who have mines, and you get jobs because you underbid your competition. Okay. So having more freedom to make the choices that you want also has the benefit of having fewer laws, right? Because people become self-regulating. We don't want to intentionally make bad choices. And once we realize that the consequences, the responsibility of the results of their choices are ours and ours alone, then we become more careful with the choices that we make. More freedom, more voluntary choices. This is the solution for the problem of institutional racism. I will see you in the next episode.